The dawn of conflict. War is as old as humanity itself. Long before the clash of empires, before swords rang against shields, before written history etched the names of conquerors into stone, there were battles. Tribes fought for land, for resources, for survival. Conflict in its earliest form was not just about destruction, it was about definition. War shaped who we were and who we would become. When we talk about ancient wars, we are not merely recounting tales of violence. We are tracing the evolution of civilization. For every battlefield, there was a consequence, a new technology, a cultural exchange, or a power shift that set the stage for the future. War forced innovation. It toppled the mighty and raised the obscure. It drew borders, forged nations, and built legacies that still echo today. So, let us journey back to the beginning. The first clashes, prehistoric battles. Imagine a world where survival itself was a daily struggle. Hunter-gatherers roamed forests and plains, competing with beasts and each other. Anthropologists believe that some of the earliest large-scale conflicts occurred more than 10,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence at sites like Jebel Sahaba in modern-day Sudan reveals mass graves dating back to around 12,000 BC. Skeletons marked with spear points, arrowheads, and blunt force trauma. These people were not soldiers in uniform, but ordinary humans caught in violent clashes over land, water, and food. This was the birth of organized violence. And though primitive, these conflicts mattered. They taught humanity that cooperation, forming groups, tribes, and eventually alliances, was essential for defense and survival. In a way, war accelerated social complexity. To defend a territory, people needed leaders, strategies, and systems. What began as skirmishes around watering holes laid the groundwork for the idea of armies, generals, and nations. The Sumerians and the first recorded wars fast forward to around 3000 BC. Civilization had blossomed in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Here the Sumerians built the world's first cities, Uruk, Ur, and Lachish. With cities came walls, temples, kings, and enemies. The first recorded war in history occurred between Lagash and Umma, two Sumerian city-states. Cuneiform tablets carved into clay describe territorial disputes and bloody clashes. This was not random violence anymore. It was war with a political purpose. Control of farmland and irrigation canals meant survival, and the Sumerians understood this well. The impact. War pushed humanity to create bureaucracy. Armies needed to be fed, equipped, and managed. City-states developed taxation systems and centralized authority to maintain their forces. War also inspired innovation in weaponry, bronze weapons, war chariots, and fortified city walls. In short, conflict pushed Mesopotamia to become the first complex state system in history. Egypt and the birth of empire. No ancient civilization captured the imagination quite like Egypt. The pharaohs built monuments that still defy time, but their empire was forged through war. Around 1500 BC, the Egyptian New Kingdom rose to power under warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III. They expanded Egypt's borders far beyond the Nile, into the Levant and Nubia. Their campaigns brought wealth, slaves, and tribute, but more importantly, they introduced Egypt to the world stage. Egyptian warfare gave us the first clear example of how war spreads culture. By conquering neighbors, Egyptians absorbed foreign gods, art, and technologies. The composite bow, for instance, was adopted from the Hyksos, a foreign people who once invaded Egypt. Through conflict, Egypt became both stronger and more interconnected with the rest of the ancient world. And then came Kadesh. In 1274 BC, Pharaoh Ramesses II clashed with the Hittites in one of the most famous battles of antiquity. Chariots thundered across the plains, tens of thousands of soldiers fought, and propaganda was born. Both Egypt and the Hittites declared victory, engraving their triumphs into stone and tablets. In truth, it was likely a stalemate. Yet from this battle emerged something extraordinary, the world's first known peace treaty. Here lies one of the deepest truths about war. It does not only destroy, it teaches. War forced humanity to negotiate, to recognize the limits of force, and to imagine peace as a strategy. The Assyrian war machine. If Egypt showed us the splendor of empire, the Assyrians revealed the terrifying efficiency of conquest. Rising in Mesopotamia around the 9th century BC, the Assyrians built an empire fueled by war. They perfected the art of organized brutality. Assyrian armies were professional, disciplined, and equipped with advanced siege technologies. They invented battering rams, siege towers, and psychological warfare. Cities that resisted were met with mass deportations or slaughter. The message was clear: submit or perish. But here is the paradox. The Assyrian Empire, cruel as it was, created the foundation for modern governance. By moving conquered peoples across their empire, they spread languages, ideas, and technologies. They built roads to move armies quickly, roads that would later be copied by the Persians and Romans. In their quest for dominance, the Assyrians inadvertently knitted the ancient Near East into a connected world. War, once again, was the engine of change. The Greeks, war and democracy, crossed the Aegean, and we arrive in ancient Greece. Here, war was not only about conquest, it was about identity. The Greek city-states, fiercely independent, often fought one another. But when a greater enemy appeared, the Persian Empire, they united. The Persian Wars of the 5th century BC changed the trajectory of Western civilization. At Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, small Greek city-states defeated the mighty Persians. Their victory did more than secure independence. It gave birth to confidence in a new idea: democracy. Athens, in particular, believed its political system had triumphed against tyranny. This belief fueled the golden age of Greece, the age of philosophy, theater, science, and art. Socrates asked questions, Pericles built the Parthenon, and Hippocrates studied medicine. None of this would have been possible without the crucible of war. But the Greeks also showed us war's darker side. The Peloponnesian War, Athens against Sparta, tore the Greek world apart. Decades of bloodshed weakened the city-states, making them vulnerable to a rising power to the north, Macedonia. War, once the force that inspired democracy, now paved the way for its downfall. Alexander the Great. A world united by war. No figure demonstrates the world-changing power of war more than Alexander the Great. In just over a decade, he conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. His campaigns spread Greek language, culture, and ideas across 3 continents. This was the birth of the Hellenistic world. But Alexander's wars did more than expand borders. They fused civilizations. Greek philosophy blended with Eastern religions. Cities like Alexandria and Egypt became centers of learning where scholars studied science, mathematics, and astronomy. The exchange of ideas sparked by Alexander's conquests shaped the intellectual foundation of the Western and Eastern worlds alike. Here we see perhaps the greatest irony of war. While it destroys cities, it also builds bridges between cultures. Without Alexander's wars, there would be no Hellenistic world. And without the Hellenistic world, Rome, Christianity, and even modern science would look very different. Rome, the empire of war. Rome was built by war, sustained by war, and defined by war. From its earliest days as a small city-state, Rome expanded through relentless conquest. By the time of the emperors, it controlled the entire Mediterranean. Roman legions were more than soldiers. They were engineers, builders, and diplomats. Every new conquest brought roads, aqueducts, and cities. War turned Rome into a machine that could absorb other cultures. From the Greeks, they borrowed philosophy and art. From the Carthaginians, naval tactics. From the Gauls and Germans, new military strategies. But Rome's wars also carried heavy costs. The Punic Wars, fought against Carthage, reshaped the Mediterranean. Hannibal's elephants marched across the Alps, terrorizing Italy. Yet Rome emerged victorious, and Carthage was wiped off the map. From this, Rome gained dominance, but also a hunger for expansion that would never be satisfied. The Roman Empire became the ultimate example of how war can shape the world. It created laws, languages, and infrastructure that still influence us today. But it also proved the fatal flaw of war-driven empires. Eventually, the weight of endless conflict collapses the very system it builds. Rome's fall was not just a political event, it was a lesson written in blood. The Age of Transformation. The fall of Rome, the world shattered. The Roman Empire once seemed eternal. Its roads stretched thousands of miles. Its laws bound together dozens of nations, and its legions stood as an unbreakable wall. Yet in the 5th century AD, that wall crumbled. Rome, the symbol of civilization, fell. The causes were many: corruption, economic strain, internal decay. But above all, it was war that shattered Rome. Waves of so-called barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns, pressed against the empire's borders. These were not mindless raiders. They were peoples on the move, displaced by pressures to the east. They wanted land, safety, and opportunity. And when Rome could not provide it, they took it. In 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome. For centuries, the city had stood as the heart of the known world. Now it burned. To contemporaries, it seemed as though the world itself had ended, and in a sense it had. The old Roman order was gone, replaced by a patchwork of kingdoms across Europe. Yet destruction gave birth to transformation. Roman law, architecture, and language did not vanish. They fused with Germanic traditions, laying the groundwork for medieval Europe. War had broken the empire, but in doing so, it created the cultural mix that would define the next 1,000 years. Byzantium, the empire that refused to die. Though Rome fell in the west, it lived on in the east. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, carried the Roman torch for another 1,000 years. Byzantium's survival depended on war. Surrounded by enemies, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Turks, it developed a reputation for resilience. Byzantine armies perfected the use of heavy cavalry, known as cataphracts, and wielded a secret weapon: Greek fire, a flammable liquid that burned even on water. It was the medieval world's equivalent of a superweapon. But Byzantium's wars did more than defend territory. They preserved knowledge. While Western Europe descended into what many call the Dark Ages, Byzantine scholars copied ancient texts, studied philosophy, and kept alive the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Every time Byzantium fought for survival, it was also fighting to protect the cultural inheritance of the ancient world. Without those wars, without that stubborn survival, much of classical knowledge might have been lost forever. And centuries later, when scholars fled the crumbling empire and carried their books to Italy, the spark of the Renaissance was lit: the rise of Islam. A new power emerges. In the 7th century, a new force swept across the deserts of Arabia: Islam. Within a single lifetime, Islamic armies expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula, conquering vast territories from Spain to India. What made these conquests world-changing was not just their speed, but their consequence. The Islamic caliphates became crossroads of culture. Greek philosophy, Persian science, Indian mathematics, all of it converged under Islamic rule. The numerals we use today, algebra, advances in medicine and astronomy, these were carried forward because of Islamic expansion. War made it possible. The Battle of Yarmouk crushed Byzantine hopes of reclaiming Syria. The conquest of Persia ended an ancient empire, replacing Zoroastrian traditions with Islam. In Spain, Islamic rule created Al-Andalus, a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side, exchanging ideas that would shape Europe's intellectual awakening. These wars were not just about territory. They redrew the spiritual map of the world. A new religion, spread by conquest, diplomacy, and trade, became a global faith that still shapes billions of lives today. The Viking raids, shockwaves from the north. While the Islamic caliphates flourished, Europe faced a storm from another direction. In the 8th and 9th centuries, longships appeared on the horizon. The Vikings had arrived. To monks and peasants, the Vikings were terror incarnate, raiders who struck without warning, burning monasteries and looting towns. Yet their wars were more than destruction. They reshaped Europe's political landscape. And the Vikings themselves did not remain raiders. They became settlers, traders, and even kings. In Normandy, they carved out a duchy. In Russia, they founded dynasties. In Greenland and even North America, they left traces of their voyages. Here again, war served as a paradox. It brought fear and bloodshed, but also integration and exploration. The shockwaves from Viking swords set into motion the nations of medieval Europe. The Crusades, faith and fire. By the 11th century, war took on a new form: Holy War. The Crusades began as a call from the Pope to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. For 2 centuries, wave after wave of European knights marched east, driven by faith, greed, and adventure. The Crusades were brutal. Cities were sacked, populations slaughtered, and kingdoms carved out in blood. Yet as with all wars, their consequences reach far beyond the battlefield. Through contact with the Islamic world, Europeans encountered advanced medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. They tasted new spices, adopted new technologies, and reconnected with classical learning preserved in the East. The Crusades, though a failure in their immediate goal, became a bridge. They reopened Europe to the wider world, setting the stage for trade, exploration, and eventually the Renaissance. They also left scars. The memory of Crusader conquest and massacre lingered in the Middle East, shaping perceptions of the West for centuries. War once again proved that every conquest leaves echoes, both constructive and destructive, long after the swords are sheathed. The Mongol storm. The world conquered, and then came the Mongols. In the 13th century, a thunderclap from the steppes changed history forever. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, Mongol armies swept across Asia and into Europe, creating the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. The Mongols were masters of mobility, striking with horse archers who could travel vast distances in days. They crushed kingdoms, toppled dynasties, and burned cities. Baghdad, once a jewel of the Islamic world, was reduced to ruins in 1258. Yet the Mongols did not only destroy, they connected. For the first time, nearly the entire Eurasian landmass was linked under one system. Trade along the Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. Goods, technologies, and ideas moved more freely than ever before. Paper, gunpowder, and the compass traveled westward, while art and science traveled eastward. Even the Black Death, the plague that killed millions in Europe, likely spread along these Mongol-secured routes. War had created a truly interconnected world, for better and for worse. A world transformed by the 14th century. The world had been remade. The fall of Rome had broken an empire but created nations. Byzantium had preserved the ancient past. Islam had risen as a global faith. The Vikings had shocked Europe into unity. The Crusades had reconnected East and West. And the Mongols had tied the world together in ways unseen before. Each of these wars brought devastation. Each left behind ruins, corpses, and grief. Yet each also carved the pathways of our modern world. Borders, religions, languages, trade routes, all of them bear the fingerprints of ancient wars. War is the great paradox of human history. It destroys, but it also creates. It kills, but it also connects. From the ashes of battlefields, new worlds are born, and as we step into the modern age, the lessons of those ancient wars remain written across our history. The 100 Years' War, the birth of nations. In the 14th century, Europe descended into one of the longest conflicts in history, the 100 Years' War. Though the name suggests a single war, it was really a tangled series of battles, truces, and shifting alliances between England and France. At first glance, it seemed a struggle over dynastic claims, who had the right to the French throne. But beneath the crowns and banners, something deeper was happening. This was not only a war of kings, it was a war that forged nations. For France, the war became a crucible of identity. Figures like Joan of Arc turned the conflict into a holy mission, uniting peasants and nobles under a shared sense of Frenchness. For England, the war created a rising national pride, but also planted the seeds of future turmoil as defeats shook faith in kingship. And the war brought innovation. The English longbow, wielded by commoners, shattered the dominance of heavily armored knights at battles like Agincourt. The feudal order, lords on horseback dominating peasants, was breaking down. Power was shifting, slowly but surely, towards centralized states that could finance large standing armies. The 100 Years' War left both kingdoms exhausted, but out of the ashes, two nations emerged stronger, more defined, and ready to play their part in the coming modern world. The Ottoman conquests, the end of an era. While England and France fought in the West, a new power rose in the East. The Ottoman Turks, driven by ambition and faith, built an empire that stretched from the Middle East into Europe. In 1453, the world changed forever. The Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, laid siege to Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the city had stood as the bastion of Rome's legacy. Its walls had repelled countless invaders. But this time was different. The Ottomans brought with them massive cannons, pounding the ancient defenses into dust. When the city fell, it marked the end of Byzantium and the end of the medieval world. Constantinople became Istanbul, capital of a Muslim empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. But the fall of Constantinople did more than redraw borders. It closed off traditional land routes between Europe and Asia. Suddenly, Europeans found themselves cut off from the spices, silks, and riches of the East. And so they looked elsewhere, across the oceans. The Ottoman victory indirectly sparked the age of exploration. War at one gate opened new doors across the seas, the age of gunpowder. The fall of Constantinople revealed something even greater. The age of gunpowder had begun. For centuries, knights in shining armor had dominated battlefields. Castles stood as impenetrable fortresses, but with cannons and firearms, all of that changed. Gunpowder was not invented in Europe. It came from China, carried west along the Silk Road, adopted first by the Islamic world, and finally by European powers. Yet once it arrived, it reshaped everything. Castles that had stood for centuries crumbled under cannon fire. Armored knights found themselves obsolete against musket volleys. War became less about noble warriors and more about disciplined masses of soldiers. Armies grew larger, more professional, and more expensive. Rulers now needed centralized governments to tax and fund them. In short, gunpowder wars gave birth to the modern state. Kings became more powerful, feudal lords weaker. Parliaments and bureaucracies expanded to manage the costs of war. The battlefield was no longer just about swords and shields. It was about gunpowder, logistics, and money. The Spanish Reconquista and beyond. Meanwhile, in Iberia, another transformation was taking shape. For centuries, Muslim and Christian kingdoms had fought for control of Spain. This long struggle, known as the Reconquista, culminated in 1492 with the fall of Granada. Christian forces, led by Ferdinand and Isabella, finally expelled the last Muslim stronghold. But 1492 was significant for another reason. That same year, Christopher Columbus set sail westward, seeking a route to Asia, and stumbled upon the Americas. War had prepared Spain for empire. Centuries of fighting had built a militarized society, skilled in conquest. And when Spanish forces arrived in the New World, they brought those skills with them. The conquistadors toppled empires like the Aztecs and Incas, not only with steel and horses, but with the ruthless experience of generations of war. The conquest of the Americas unleashed consequences that reverberated worldwide. Gold and silver flooded into Europe, fueling economies and wars alike. Indigenous civilizations were devastated, reshaping demographics forever. And the age of global empires, born from conflict, had begun. Colonial wars, a global battlefield. The discovery of the Americas did not just enrich Spain, it sparked competition. Portugal, England, France, and later the Dutch all sought colonies, and they fought each other across the globe to gain them. For the first time, wars were no longer confined to regions. A conflict in Europe could spill into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Navies became the new powerhouses, carrying soldiers and supplies across oceans. The world itself had become a battlefield. Colonial wars spread languages, religions, and cultures across continents. They also spread suffering, the transatlantic slave trade, the destruction of indigenous peoples, and the exploitation of resources. But these wars also connected the globe in ways unimaginable before. Spices from Asia flavored European kitchens. Silver from the Americas fueled Chinese markets. The modern world economy was forged in the fire of colonial conflict. The rise of professional armies. As wars grew larger and more global, one thing became clear. Feudal levies and part-time soldiers were no longer enough. Kings needed permanent, professional armies. This shift transformed societies. Standing armies required regular payment, uniforms, training, and organization. States developed new systems of taxation, centralized authority, and administrative control. War was no longer seasonal. It was a permanent state of readiness. And with professional armies came new ideas of loyalty and discipline. Soldiers fought not only for lords or villages, but for crowns, nations, and increasingly for ideologies. The shift from medieval warfare to early modern warfare laid the foundations for nationalism, revolutions, and the wars of ideology that would dominate the centuries ahead. The world at the dawn of modernity. By the 16th century, the world had been transformed by war. The Hundred Years' War had forged the first true nations of Europe. The Ottomans had ended the ancient legacy of Rome, pushing Europe toward exploration. Gunpowder had rewritten the rules of battle, sweeping away the medieval order. Spain and Portugal had carried conquest across oceans, launching the age of global empires. The age of knights and castles was gone. In its place stood kings with cannons, explorers with ships, and empires with armies stretching across continents. War had once again changed the course of humanity. It had ended the medieval world and birthed the modern one. And as the 16th century gave way to the 17th and 18th, war would continue to evolve, shaping revolutions, philosophies, and the balance of power that still echoes today. How ancient wars changed our world. The age of revolutions and empires. The 30 Years' War, faith, power, and devastation. The year was 1618. In Prague, angry Protestants hurled Catholic officials out of a window, an event known as the Defenestration of Prague. Few could have imagined that this spark would ignite one of the most destructive wars in European history, the 30 Years' War. What began as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants soon spiraled into something far greater. Princes, kings, and emperors joined the fray, driven not only by faith but by ambition. Spain, France, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire all clashed across Central Europe. The war lasted 3 decades, leaving entire regions devastated. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and populations slaughtered. Famine and disease swept across the continent. In some German lands, nearly 1/3 of the population perished. And yet, out of this nightmare came transformation. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, ended the war and redrew the political map of Europe. More importantly, it established the principle of state sovereignty, the idea that each nation had the right to govern itself without outside interference. This concept, born from bloodshed, remains the cornerstone of international relations today. The 30 Years' War showed that war could not only destroy kingdoms, it could rewrite the rules of the world itself. The English Civil War, the people and the crown. While Central Europe bled, another conflict unfolded on the British Isles, the English Civil War. At its heart was a question that would echo for centuries. Who truly holds power, the monarch or the people? King Charles I believed in divine right, ruling as though his authority came directly from God. But Parliament pushed back, demanding rights, checks, and limitations. The clash between royalists and parliamentarians erupted into full-scale war. The conflict was brutal, dividing families and communities. But it gave rise to new ideas. When Oliver Cromwell's forces triumphed and Charles I was executed, it sent shockwaves across Europe. For the first time, a king had been tried and killed by his own subjects. The message was clear. Monarchy was not absolute. Though the monarchy was eventually restored, the war laid the foundation for constitutional government in Britain. Over time, it would inspire revolutions in America, France, and beyond. Once again, war proved to be the engine of political transformation, the Enlightenment and the wars of ideas. By the 18th century, a new intellectual movement was sweeping across Europe, the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu challenged old traditions, calling for reason, liberty, and equality. And as always, war became the stage on which ideas were tested. Conflicts like the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War were fought over dynastic claims and colonial possessions. But they also reflected a new age of global struggle. The 7 Years' War, in particular, was the first truly world war. Battles raged in Europe, North America, India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Empires collided across continents, and when the dust settled, Britain emerged as the dominant global power. Its victory laid the groundwork for the British Empire, the largest empire the world would ever see. But the Enlightenment also planted the seeds of revolution. People began to question monarchy, aristocracy, and inequality. And soon war would not just be fought over crowns and colonies, it would be fought over principles. The American Revolution, a new world is born. In 1775, gunfire echoed at Lexington and Concord. The American colonies, long under British rule, had risen in rebellion. What began as a tax dispute turned into something far greater, a revolution for independence. The American Revolution was unique because it was fueled not just by grievances, but by ideas, liberty, self-rule, and democracy. Colonial militias and continental armies, led by figures like George Washington, faced the might of the British Empire. Against the odds, they triumphed. The result was not only a new nation, the United States of America, but a new model of governance. The ideals of freedom and democracy, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, inspired movements worldwide. Here, war had birthed not just a country, but a vision of the future. The echo of muskets in America was heard across oceans, sparking revolutions in Europe and Latin America. The French Revolution and the Wars of Nations. Only a few years later, Europe itself erupted. In 1789, the French Revolution toppled a monarchy and declared the rights of man. It was not just a revolt, it was a reimagining of society. But revolutions do not go unchallenged. Monarchies across Europe, fearful of the spread of these radical ideas, declared war on revolutionary France. What followed was chaos. Kings versus citizens, empires versus ideals. The wars of the French Revolution transformed the very nature of warfare. No longer were armies small professional forces. Revolutionary France called upon its citizens to fight, creating mass armies loyal not to a king, but to a nation. The age of nationalism had begun. This shift would change war forever. Armies grew larger, fiercer, and more determined. They fought not for crowns, but for identities, a trend that would dominate the modern age. Napoleon, the world reordered. Out of the French Revolution rose one of history's most extraordinary figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. Soldier, general, emperor. His name became synonymous with ambition and conquest. Napoleon harnessed the power of nationalism, building armies millions strong. He shattered old monarchies, redrew borders, and spread revolutionary ideals across Europe. His victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram stunned the world. But Napoleon's wars were not just battles, they were transformations. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that influenced nations far beyond France. He restructured governments, abolished feudal privileges, and spread the principle of merit over birth. Of course, his ambitions also led to devastation. The Peninsular War drained French resources. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was a catastrophe, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost to cold and hunger. Finally, at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was defeated. Yet his impact endured. The map of Europe had been remade. Old empires had fallen. Nationalism, once a spark, was now a wildfire. War had birthed the modern age of nations, and Europe would never be the same again. A world at the edge of change. By the early 19th century, the world stood transformed. The 30 Years' War had given us the idea of sovereign states. The English Civil War had planted the seeds of constitutional government. The Enlightenment and its wars had globalized conflict and spread new philosophies. The American and French revolutions had declared that people, not kings, were the true source of power. And Napoleon had spread nationalism across a continent. Once again, war had been both destroyer and creator. It tore down old systems but raised new ones in their place. And as the 19th century dawned, wars would continue to push humanity forward, toward industry, revolution, and conflicts even greater than before. The age of nationalism and industry, 19th century wars. War, by the 19th century, was no longer the struggle of kings alone. It was the struggle of nations. The rise of nationalism, industrial power, and global empires meant that conflicts would be bigger, bloodier, and more transformative than ever before. The Napoleonic aftershock. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 did not bring a lasting peace. Instead, Europe entered a century of upheaval. The French Revolution had planted the seeds of nationalism and popular sovereignty, and those seeds could not be buried by monarchs restoring the old order. From Spain to Germany, from Italy to the Balkans, people began to imagine new nations forged in war. The Congress of Vienna tried to suppress these ideas by balancing power among empires, but balance was fragile. Wars of liberation and rebellion would soon shake the continent. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1830. In the early 1820s, the Greeks rose against Ottoman rule. At first, the rebellion looked doomed, peasants with muskets against the mighty Ottoman army. But nationalism proved stronger than numbers. Volunteers poured in from across Europe, inspired by the idea of ancient Hellas reborn. Even the poet Lord Byron joined the struggle, dying in Greece and becoming a symbol of sacrifice. The war was brutal. Massacres on both sides shocked Europe. Yet it ended in triumph for the Greeks, who secured their independence with the help of Britain, France, and Russia. This was one of the first modern wars of national liberation, showing that an oppressed people could use war to create a new nation. The revolutions of 1848, by mid-century, nationalism was on fire. Across Europe, revolutions erupted in 1848. Peasants, workers, and middle-class liberals demanding rights, democracy, and unity. In Paris, barricades rose once more. In Vienna, students clashed with imperial troops. In Berlin, Frankfurt, Milan, and Budapest, the cry for freedom filled the streets. Most of these revolutions failed, crushed by conservative monarchs and armies loyal to the old order. But they planted a seed, the idea that the people, not kings, would decide the future. That idea would be forged into reality by two wars of unification. Italian unification. Italy had been a patchwork of states since the fall of Rome. But in the 19th century, men like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour led wars to unite the peninsula. Garibaldi's red shirts marched through the south, while the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia fought Austria in the north. By 1871, after decades of struggle, Italy was united. War had created a new nation where there had once been fragments. The sword, not diplomacy alone, gave birth to Italy. German unification and the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. If Italy's unification was dramatic, Germany's was thunderous. For centuries, the German-speaking world had been a patchwork of states under the loose framework of the Holy Roman Empire. But one man, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, used war to forge them into one. First, Prussia defeated Denmark in 1864, then Austria in 1866. Finally, in 1870, Prussia provoked France into declaring war. The Franco-Prussian War was short, brutal, and decisive. The French army collapsed, Paris was besieged, and Napoleon III was captured. In the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed in January 1871. This moment reshaped Europe. A powerful, united Germany had risen, altering the balance of power forever. War had created a new giant on the continent, setting the stage for conflicts yet to come. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Across the Atlantic, the United States was torn apart by its own war, the bloodiest conflict in its history. At its heart was the question of slavery and the survival of the Union. When Southern states seceded, Abraham Lincoln declared that the Union must be preserved at all costs. The Civil War was not just a struggle of muskets and cannons, it was the first modern war. Railroads carried troops by the thousands. Telegraph wires carried orders in real time. Ironclad ships clashed on rivers. Rifled muskets and repeating rifles made battlefields deadlier than ever before. The war devastated the South, freed 4 million enslaved people, and preserved the United States as a single nation. But it came at a terrible cost. More than 600,000 dead. The Civil War showed the world how industrial technology had changed the nature of war forever. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Crimean War pitted Russia against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. It was fought over influence in the crumbling Ottoman domains, but it became a showcase of modern warfare. Trenches, railways, and telegraphs made their debut. For the first time, war was photographed, and the public could see its grim reality. This was also the War of Florence Nightingale, who transformed nursing and battlefield medicine, saving countless lives. The Crimean War exposed the horrors of industrialized combat and revealed how unprepared armies still were for the New Age. Colonial wars and the scramble for Africa beyond Europe and America. The 19th century was also the century of empire. European powers expanded into Africa and Asia, waging wars against indigenous kingdoms. Superior weapons, machine guns, repeating rifles, steamships, gave them overwhelming advantage. In battles like Omdurman in 1898, a handful of British troops armed with Maxim guns mowed down tens of thousands of Sudanese warriors. These colonial wars carved up Africa, redrew maps, and subjected millions to imperial rule. War had become a tool not only of nation-building, but of global domination. The Franco-Prussian legacy. When the Franco-Prussian War ended in 1871, it left more than a united Germany. It left bitterness in France, which had lost Alsace-Lorraine. It left fear in Britain, watching Germany rise. And it left Europe in a delicate balance of alliances and rivalries. The 19th century had seen wars that created nations, toppled empires, and spread colonial power across the globe. But the weapons of industry, the nationalism of peoples, and the ambitions of leaders were building towards something even greater and more catastrophic. The 20th century was waiting, and with it, wars that would dwarf everything humanity had ever seen. The century of nationalism had shown that war could unite nations, destroy empires, and spread industry across the world. But in the next century, those same forces would explode into wars of a scale so vast, so destructive, that they would change not only history, but the very idea of civilization itself. The world at war, 20th century catastrophes. The First World War, the war to end all wars. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction that would engulf the globe. Europe, already a powder keg of alliances, militarism, and nationalism, exploded into the First World War. The war was unprecedented. Millions of soldiers were mobilized across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Industrialized weaponry, machine guns, tanks, poison gas, and heavy artillery made battlefields killing grounds unlike anything humanity had seen. Cities were shelled, forests burned, and entire regions devastated. The Western Front, stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, became a trench labyrinth. Soldiers lived in mud, filth, and constant danger. No tactics seemed sufficient against the technology of war. Millions perished for yards of territory, their deaths seemingly meaningless to generals far from the front. But beyond the battlefield, the war reshaped politics. Monarchies toppled, the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria, Hungary. Empires fractured, giving birth to new nations across Europe and the Middle East. Borders were redrawn, often arbitrarily, planting seeds for future conflicts. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 sought to secure peace, but it punished Germany with heavy reparations and territorial losses. The war to end all wars had failed to end human conflict. It merely set the stage for another, even greater conflagration. World War I, a global conflict. Though centered in Europe, the war was truly global. Colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were drawn into the conflict. Troops from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa fought and died for empires that claimed their lands. The war spread ideas, technology, and cultural exchange, but also reinforced hierarchies of domination and exploitation. Total war had arrived. Governments controlled economies, censored information, and mobilized entire populations for the war effort. Industry, science, and propaganda became weapons just as deadly as rifles and shells. Humanity had entered a new age, the era in which modern warfare was intertwined with the entire fabric of society. The interwar years. The calm before the storm. After 1918, the world tried to recover. The League of Nations was founded, hoping to prevent future conflicts. Yet the wounds of war, economic instability, and unresolved national grievances created fertile ground for new violence. The rise of fascism in Italy, the emergence of Hitler in Germany, and militarism in Japan were all reactions to the instability left by the First World War. Once again, nationalism and ambition proved powerful forces, this time with deadly consequences. World War II, the total war. By 1939, Europe and the world were engulfed in a second, even more devastating conflict. World War II involved nearly every nation on Earth, mobilizing more than 100 million people in uniform. Germany, Italy, and Japan, Axis powers, sought to expand their territories aggressively. They relied on ideology, propaganda, and industrial might. Meanwhile, the Allies, led by Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, fought not only for survival, but for the preservation of global order. The war was total. Cities were bombed from the air. Civilians were deliberately targeted. The Holocaust revealed the capacity for systematic, industrialized murder on an unimaginable scale. Millions of lives were extinguished not on the battlefield, but in factories, ghettos, and camps designed for extermination. Meanwhile, technology accelerated at a breakneck pace. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, radar, code-breaking machines, and ultimately nuclear weapons reshaped the art of war forever. Science had become as lethal as strategy. Global consequences. World War II redrew the world map. Empires collapsed. Britain and France lost their overseas colonies. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, shaping global politics for decades. The United Nations was founded to prevent another global catastrophe, though it would struggle to contain the Cold War that followed. Economically, the war left some nations devastated and others enriched. Socially, it accelerated movements for civil rights, women's emancipation, and decolonization. Technology developed for destruction became the backbone of post-war society, from nuclear power to jet engines and computers. Lessons of the World Wars. The World Wars showed the terrifying potential of modern industrialized warfare. They demonstrated how ideology, nationalism, and ambition could mobilize entire societies to destruction. And yet, like all wars before them, they reshaped the world in ways that could not be undone. Borders were redrawn, nations reborn, and empires dismantled. International institutions arose to prevent war and promote diplomacy. Technology, once confined to laboratories and workshops, was unleashed on a global scale. The understanding that war affects not only soldiers, but entire societies became undeniable. The ancient pattern remained. Wars destroy, yet they also create. They devastate, yet they build the frameworks for the next era of human civilization. From global war to Cold War tensions. By 1945, the world had been irrevocably changed. Europe lay in ruins, Asia had been scarred by battles and atomic bombings, and millions were displaced. But humanity had also witnessed the birth of a new international order, where war would continue to shape borders, politics, and societies in ways both visible and hidden. The 20th century, shaped by these global conflicts, set the stage for the modern age. Wars had become faster, deadlier, and more total, but their impact extended far beyond the battlefield. Political ideologies, technological advancement, and human migration all bore the fingerprints of these catastrophic conflicts. And yet the lessons of ancient wars echoed still. Every empire, every nation, every people is shaped by conflict. From Rome to the Mongols, from Napoleon to the atomic age, humanity's story is inseparable from the wars it wages. From Cold War to modern conflicts, the legacy of ancient wars. The Cold War, ideology as war. After 1945, the world entered an era unlike any before, the Cold War. Unlike previous conflicts, it was not fought with armies clashing on open battlefields, at least not directly between the superpowers. Instead, the struggle was ideological, political, and technological. The United States and the Soviet Union, the new global superpowers, competed for influence across the globe. The Cold War's battles were fought in proxy wars. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and countless other places where local conflicts became part of a larger global struggle. Yet in another sense, the Cold War was a continuation of the ancient patterns of conflict. Nations sought power, influence, and security, Alliances were formed and broken, borders and governments shifted, technology was weaponized, from nuclear arsenals to space exploration, echoing the way gunpowder and cannons once reshaped medieval battlefields. Even diplomacy was a battlefield. Treaties, negotiations, and espionage became tools of war. The Cold War showed that not all wars need be fought with bullets to reshape the world. Influence, ideas, and strategy could be just as deadly. Decolonization and the wars of liberation. While the Cold War raged, another transformation was sweeping the globe. Decolonization. After centuries of European domination, colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East fought for independence. Some struggles were peaceful, others were bloody. In Algeria, Vietnam, Kenya, and elsewhere, national liberation movements engaged in protracted wars against imperial powers. Guerrilla tactics, insurgency, and asymmetric warfare became common, echoing ancient patterns where smaller forces could challenge larger empires with strategy, knowledge of terrain, and popular support. The legacy of ancient wars was clear. Centuries of empire, conquest, and resistance had created maps, cultures, and borders that could not simply vanish. Liberation wars had to navigate these legacies while forging new nations. Modern conflicts, a world still shaped by war. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, conflicts continued to reshape the world. Regional wars, civil wars, and international interventions have redrawn borders, toppled governments, and displaced millions. Technology accelerated once again. Precision-guided weapons, drones, cyber warfare, and satellite intelligence transformed warfare into a digital battlefield. Yet even with modern tools, ancient lessons remain. Strategy, geography, human morale, and the ambitions of leaders still determine the outcome. Wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and beyond reveal the enduring impact of history. Ancient empires, colonial legacies, and centuries of previous conflict influence who fights, why they fight, and how societies are structured. War remains a catalyst for change, innovation, and occasionally destruction on an unimaginable scale. The enduring legacy of ancient wars. From the earliest conflicts of humankind to the modern era, certain patterns persist. Conflict shapes civilization. Wars destroy, but they also build. Empires fall, nations rise, and societies reorganize. Rome's legions, Mongol hordes, Napoleonic armies, and nuclear arsenals each reshape the world. Technology drives change. Each era's innovations, from swords to gunpowder, cannons to nuclear bombs, transform strategy, politics, and society. Nationalism and identity. Wars create and define nations. Revolutions, unifications, and liberation movements show how people rally together, sometimes violently, to define who they are. Globalization of conflict. From the Silk Road to global empires, from world wars to Cold War proxies, wars have increasingly connected regions in conflict and cooperation. Human consequences, the human cost, lives lost, societies disrupted, and cultures reshaped, is a constant across history. Yet from this suffering comes lessons, resilience, and innovation. Ancient wars set the stage for every modern conflict. Strategies first tested in Mesopotamia, tactics honed by Rome, and lessons learned from medieval sieges echo in the drones and cyber attacks of today. A reflection. History shows us that war is both destructive and creative. It can topple kings, topple empires, and forge nations. It can destroy cities yet give birth to new ideas, technologies, and identities. Humanity's story cannot be told without the shadow of conflict. Ancient wars remind us that the patterns of human behavior are enduring. Ambition, fear, power, and survival drive societies to conflict. And though the tools and scale may change, the fundamental truths of war remain the same. From the earliest armies of Mesopotamia to the Atomic Age, from Mongol conquest to modern liberation struggles, wars have reshaped the world. They have rewritten maps, sparked revolutions, and created civilizations. And they continue to shape the world we inhabit today. In studying the past, we see that every modern conflict, every political tension, and every societal shift has roots stretching back through centuries of warfare. The story of human history is inseparable from the story of war. And perhaps in understanding this, we might better navigate the future, learning from the mistakes, triumphs, and legacies left by countless generations who fought, endured, and rebuilt.